In this morning's text, the yoke to which Jesus was referring was more than likely the yoke of the Torah, the words of law found within the first 5 books of our Bible. You see, an ox yoke was a common metaphor in the ancient world for the Torah. Later in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says the scribes and Pharisees tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. And so for that reason, I think Jesus was saying that his yoke, his rendering of the law, which included grace and forgiveness, was lighter than the burden that the Pharisees and scribes placed upon the people, which would have been the heavy burdens of religious expectations. But I've spent the last 3 weeks preaching on toxic religion, so you may not need to hear any more about that sort of thing. And so if we acknowledge that I may be taking some liberties with this morning's text, even to the point of taking it out of context, then maybe we can apply it to the burdens you and I are experiencing today. Burdens that extend beyond religion and weigh upon us in our daily living. If I were to ask you to raise your hand if you are weary, if you feel burdened in any way, and if you could stand some rest, I suspect all of you would raise your hands without so much as a second thought. And so this morning's verses are important and meaningful to us. They are important because they feel personal. We all need rest from our burdens, and we're not the only ones. It's been a rough year for the American psyche. As it turns out, folks in the U.S. are more unhappy today than they've been in nearly 50 years. This bold yet unsurprising conclusion comes from the COVID response tracking study conducted at the University of Chicago. It finds that just 14% of American adults say they're very happy. And since the surveys were done before the death of George Floyd, I suspect the numbers are even lower today. We are feeling the burdens of our day, and we could all use a break. There is the burden of COVID-19 isolation. It's been 3.5 months, and the infection rate is still growing. We cannot connect with our family and friends the way we would like. We're suffering from lack of person-to-person touches and hugs, and it shows. There is the burden of racism, something our black sisters and brothers live with every day of their lives. But nationwide protests in recent weeks have rekindled a roaring public discourse about racial inequality in America, and now white America is waking up to the disparities that exist along nearly every facet of American life, including employment, wealth, education, home ownership, health care, and incarceration. There is the burden of LGBTQ discrimination. Because of a recent Supreme Court ruling, an employer may not be able to legally fire a person because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but if they want, they will find another reason for the firing. Discrimination still exists in healthcare, housing, education, adoption agencies, and in our churches. We are burdened by anti-transgender violence. 2020 has already seen at least 17 transgender or gender non-conforming people fatally shot or killed by other violent means in the U.S. I say at least because too often these stories go unreported or misreported. We are burdened by the economic downturn. The employment population ratio, The number of employed people as a percentage of the U.S. adult population plunged to 52.8% in May, meaning 47.2% of Americans are jobless. One expert says to get the employment to population ratio back to where it was at its peak in 2000, we need to create 30 million jobs. And so our ears perk up when we hear Jesus say, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." That is, until we hear his invitation to take his yoke upon us. We're feeling burdened, and a yoke of any sort doesn't sound very soothing, even if Jesus made the bold claim that it's an easy yoke. But Jesus' audience would have known that pulling heavy loads was a task shared by two animals accustomed to each other, using a yoke that was particularly suited to each of them. And that's what it means to say that a yoke is easy. A more practical translation might be serviceable. A well-shaped yoke let oxen be as strong as they could possibly be, and also protected them from injuries that would weaken them. Imagine the effect of a yoke that rubbed the skin raw and left it bleeding, oozing sores just where the weight of work would be borne. We have been working hard under our burdens, doing our best at handling them on our own, and our spirits have begun to chafe under the load. The solution to our problems, Jesus says, is to take on his yoke. It's a yoke that allows him to share the load with us, and it won't scrape at us and wear us down. And so what does his yoke look like? I think it looks like forgiveness, nonviolence, service to the least of these, and radical inclusion. These are the sorts of things that Jesus modeled with his life, and they are what he taught his disciples. In this morning's text, when he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me," these are the sorts of things I think he wants us to learn. And this, I think, is what his yoke looks like. In our desire for release from our burdens, we may not like the idea of exchanging our yoke for another one. We want complete and utter freedom. But that's just not the way life seems to work. There are the yokes of injustice that I have already mentioned, yokes that many of us experience on a daily basis. There are the yokes of our own making, such as those of greed and anger and resentment. And there is the yoke that Jesus invites us to take upon ourselves. A yoke, as I said, of forgiveness, nonviolence, service to the least of these, and radical inclusion. No one is really ever free. We simply exchange one yoke for another. We still have to strain at the load. God only knows how I have strained at forgiveness and nonviolence. But compared to the burden we carried before, Jesus' burden is light, as he says in this morning's reading, and the yoke fits us better than the one we had before. So if you're looking for rest from the things that threaten to overwhelm you, things like fear and worry and complete and utter exhaustion, then try taking on Jesus' yoke of forgiveness and grace. If you're able to do this, there's a good chance you'll experience a bit of relief. And isn't that something we could all use today? Amen.